Hello again. Today, in this video, I'd like to talk about something that I consider one of the most important topics that I want you to be thinking about this semester. This idea of organisms changing. Remember when we talked about living things, we talked about the idea of change, that organisms will change over time. Well, let's look at that a little more carefully as we describe and discuss the ideas of evolution and our primary way of thinking about evolutionary change, natural selection. So, notice, I'm trying to remind you, trying to emphasize this idea that one thing we expect from living things is that they will change. If we watch them, we expect them to change over time. It's a key attribute. It seems to be one of the essential qualities of living things. Let's think first of all about more of a short-term kind of change, acclimatization. Now, we're focusing here on changes that occur during the lifetime of an organism. Now, as an example, I moved to New Mexico from Boston. So I came from sea level to a 5,000-foot elevation. My body changed in response to me moving from one environmental condition to another. So notice, my body had the ability, me as an organism, I had the ability to adjust or change in response to a change in my environment. I did it during my lifetime. What were some of those changes? Well, a simple one was I started to make more red blood cells. Also, I probably began to increase the concentration of hemoglobin molecules in my red blood cells. Those adjustments or those changes during my lifetime are called acclimatization, or you'll sometimes see people refer to it as acclimation. Now, one of the things that a biologist would not be happy with is if somebody said, hey, I moved here from Boston and I adapted to the high altitude. Notice, by using the word adapt from a biological perspective, that means something very different. So, once again, if you're using a time frame of the lifetime of an individual organism, then we want to think of that change as being acclimation or acclimatization. But what if we want to think about change over a longer period of time? Now we're focusing on generational change. When a population of organisms, notice, in acclimatization we were talking about an individual organism changing during its lifetime. Now with evolution, we're talking about a population of organisms changing over generational time. Now there are a number of things that can cause this change, and what we're really focused on is not necessarily just the physical appearance of the population of organisms. More appropriately, biologists are interested in the change in their genetic material that occurs, the change in their hereditary molecules, the genes we pass on from one generation to the next. So if we're focused on that kind of change of a population, then we're dealing with the idea of evolutionary change. Okay? Now there are a number of things that can cause this change. There's a number of factors that can influence the genetic makeup of a population. Mutation, that's changes in the information molecules themselves. And we'll talk more about those, both in this video and also in a future lecture on genetics. Gene flow, that's organisms moving into and out of populations. Immigration and emigration are examples of gene flow. Genetic drift, that's what happens when very small populations get isolated, let's say, or a population gets blown to an island, a population of birds or insects, and becomes a very small subset. That can change the genetic makeup of a population. And also, there's sexual selection and natural selection. Sexual selection is the kind of thing that goes on when a female peahen, female peahen, that's redundant, a peahen looks at all those different peacocks and decides which male has the best tail, and therefore is the male that she would prefer to mate with. That's what's referred to as sexual selection, and that can change the genetic makeup over generations of populations. And then finally there's natural selection, and that's what I'm going to focus on in the next few slides and try to emphasize our understanding of what happens in this process of natural selection. Now, natural selection is an idea that was developed by Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century, and I'm sure you've probably heard about his name and heard about this idea of natural selection. And what Darwin had felt that he had developed was a theory, a set of hypotheses that explained well why organisms changed over time. He felt that the key factor, and by the way, Today we still think of this as being the key factor that causes change in populations over time. He felt that it was this process that he called natural selection. By the way, he would have separated this from or distinguished this from artificial selection, which is when man intentionally selects for different breeds of dogs, or selects for different types of pigeons, or goes out and chooses which types of pigs in his farm are going to be the successful reproducers and which ones won't be successful in reproducing. He would have called that, we call that today, artificial selection. Man intentionally causing some organisms to reproduce more than others. But clearly that idea of artificial selection helped Darwin form his ideas about this natural selection process. A simple definition, and it might be simple, but sometimes it's very difficult for people to clearly understand what's being said. The simple definition is non-random, differential reproduction. So let's take a look at that in a little more detail and see if we can understand it better. Here are some of the basic components of Darwin's idea. As he looked at the natural world, as he observed organisms, he came to a few conclusions that seem fairly evident to us today as they did to him then. Organisms have a tendency to over-reproduce. Now, what does that mean? Well, if I take a look at a cottonwood tree every year, does it only produce one seed? Because that would be all that would be really necessary to replace its body, its growth. Any pair of parents, mother and father, if they were just going to replace themselves in the population, would produce only 2 offspring. But the tendency we find is that most organisms make many, many more offspring than are necessary to just replace themselves. So they have this tendency to over-reproduce. He realized that organisms have the ability to pass characteristics from one generation to the next. Now, today we'd call that genetic information. Darwin didn't know anything about genes, but he was aware enough, as were animal breeders, farmers at that time as well, and for many generations before this, that the characteristic of one generation of parents can be passed on and become characteristics of the future generation of their offspring. So that seemed to be a fairly evident piece of information he was able to gather from the environment, just by looking at living things. He said that when I look at organisms, when I investigate the members of a population, what I find is that they don't all produce the same number of offspring. There's a lot of variability in terms of how many offspring are made from any pair of individuals or any set of parents. All you have to do is look at your neighborhood to find lots of examples of that. One family with no kids, one family with 10 kids, some families with numbers in between. But there's variability in how many offspring are produced by any set of parents. Another thing he found was that when he looked at the characteristics that those offspring possess, those varied characteristics, some of them were better fitted to their environment than others. In other words, some offspring had characteristics that allowed them to survive and reproduce better than other offspring that were produced by the same parent or other parents in the population. So not only do offspring vary in any particular generation in terms of their characteristics, but we'd also expect that they're going to vary in terms of their ability to survive, and more importantly, their ability to be able to reproduce themselves. So now this was a key idea, that he realized that there's variable reproductive success in the organisms of a population. Remember, if we go back to that definition, the simple definition, non-random differential reproduction. What we just mentioned is that differential reproduction part. There's differences in the reproductive ability of organisms in a population. Darwin said it wasn't just chance. It's not just dumb luck that organism A had 10 kids and organism B had 30 kids. He would have said that there was a non-random reason, that there was the reason of that organism having better set of characteristics. They fit their environment better. They had inherited from their parents characteristics that allowed them to survive and ultimately reproduce. Organism B with 30 kids must have had a set of characteristics, Darwin would have said, that were better fitted to the particular environment that organism lived in than organism A that produced a smaller number of offspring. He expected that those differences in reproduction were going to be the result of the characteristics that the individuals inherited from their parents. And if you think about this, that means that if organism B has certain genes, certain characteristics, and it passes those on to 30 offspring, and organism A has different characteristics, and it passes those on to 10 offspring, that future population, the future generation, is going to be different in its genetic makeup. Different in the respect that there'll be more examples of the genes from organism B than there will be genes from organism A. Notice, remember what we said evolution was: a change in the genetic makeup of a population over generations of time. Darwin said, well, yeah, of course. We see populations change. We see their genetic makeup change. We see their characteristics change. And he said it was due to this difference in the ability to survive and reproduce. Natural selection. Well, you could think of natural selection as being sort of a special case of what we talked about in terms of what the farmer does. If I have 12 piglets, I can look at those 12 piglets and say, gee, I want to keep that one and that one, based upon whatever criteria I use. In other words, the characteristics they inherited, those 2 piglets that I choose to be the parents of the next generation, had qualities that I selected them for. The other 10 piglets become bacon. Well, think about what that means is going to happen to that pig population. Through artificial selection, we're going to be able to change a population very rapidly over time. Think about what we've done to the bacterial population just since the introduction of antibiotics. We have selected them to become better able to survive in an antibiotic environment. This force of selection is very powerful, and humans do it in a quite severe way. In other words, look at those 12 piglets. Only 2 were able to reproduce, and the other 10 didn't get to reproduce at all. In nature, typically it's not quite as severe, but there will be variation among those different organisms as to who makes more offspring and who makes fewer. So the differences in the ability of these organisms to survive and reproduce determined how the population changed in its genetic makeup as it moves into the future generation. That's the essence of Darwinian theory. Now, think about what this could do. Wouldn't that allow organisms, at least over the short term, to become better able to survive in their particular environment? I'd expect the population to get better at surviving in their environment and better at surviving in their environment if each time selection is saying, okay, you folks that best fit the environment reproduce more, and you individuals that don't fit the environment very well don't reproduce as well. Well, when we see this happening, when we see a population becoming better fitted to their environment over generations of time due to natural selection, we say that the population is experiencing the process of adaptation. Or we'd say that the population is adapting to its environment. Notice, adaptation is a population level change, right? Not an individual level change. Individuals can't evolve, populations evolve. Now, sometimes you hear people talk about the individual characteristics of an organism. They'll say, oh, the tail of that organism is an adaptation for, and so that's another way to use that word, adaptation. Now we're talking about a characteristic that is a particular feature of an organism that allows it to survive well and reproduce in its environment. And we'd say, oh, that's an adaptation of that organism. We assume that it's the result of previous evolutionary change and natural selection fitting the organism to its particular environment. So long hair in an Arctic animal, or thick fat layers in marine mammals, or very little hair in organisms that live in deserts. We could think of all of those as individual characteristics that are adaptations to that particular environment. Now you might think, by the way, that, well, gee, that means organisms should become perfect over time. Here's the catch. The environment's constantly changing, isn't it? Think about how the environment is different from week to week, month to month, year to year. We don't ever have a constant, stable, completely unchanging environment, so organisms can never become perfectly fitted to their environment. Now, where does this variation come from in the first place? Because remember, we said that the organisms that are produced from one generation to the next vary. Well, that must mean that there has to be some mechanism to create changes in the information molecules that those organisms possess, their DNA, their genes. And so a topic that we're going to, well, come back to a couple different times in later chapters is this idea that information molecules like DNA, genes, can be changed at the chemical level. And we call that process mutation. We'll talk more about mutation later, but you want to realize that we tend to think of it as basically being a random process of change in the genetic makeup of organisms. And, as you probably already know, that might be the result of environmental conditions affecting the DNA of organisms. But you also want to realize that in every natural situation where organisms are copying their information, their DNA, as they get ready to pass it on to future generations, some mistakes get made. Mutation is always occurring. So that means that there's always new varieties, new variations, little changes in the information molecules that are passed from generation to generation. Now, the mutations just create the variation. Natural selection is the engine that then selects among those variations and determines which are good changes and which are bad changes. So don't think of mutation, or don't equate it with mutation equals bad. You want to equate it with mutation equals change of genetic information. And whether it's bad change or a good change or a neutral change will be determined by how that affects the organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Okay? We'll talk more about mutations later. Now, while this is the basic concept, we've modified it. Darwin wasn't aware of the idea of mutation, and he wasn't thinking about the ideas of genetic drift or gene flow that I mentioned before. But even today, we feel that he really had basically the best, the most correct explanation for what causes organisms to change. And clearly, from our perspective today, he had his finger right on the idea of what allows organisms to adapt over time to their environment. It's this process of natural selection, fine-tuning organisms from generation to generation, causing them to become better fitted to their environment. Well, as I mentioned, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, all of these represent things that occur to populations that are random. We wouldn't expect them to result in organisms changing in a direction to become better fitted to their environment. Now, they are necessary to generate, or they are very important in generating the variations that exist in populations, but selection is the key non-random process that fine-tunes organisms, determines which populations succeed, which ones go extinct. And so we think of selection as being the key evolutionary force, the force acting on populations to change them, that can be directional, that can lead to adaptation. All right, so let's recap a few of the key words. Acclimatization, remember, that was change during the lifetime of an organism. Acclimation, acclimatization. Evolution, population level change from generation to generation in the genetic makeup of an organism. Natural selection, non-random, differential reproduction. Populations changing because of differences in the reproductive ability of organisms. And finally, the result of natural selection can lead to adaptation, organisms becoming better fitted to their environment over generational time. Make sure you keep these ideas in your mind and think about them in relation to the things we talk about this semester. I'll be mentioning them over and over again, because to me this is one of the key explanatory tools that allows us to understand the living world. Well, thanks very much. I hope I've given you some things to think about. I'll see you next time.